Hi, testing the built-in mic to see how this works. Well, what a weird experience yesterday was, just having a chat about how important audiobooks could be. I was trying to share how lots of people are more comfortable with physical books because we learn how to read physical books, but we never actually learn how to listen and retain audiobooks. And in fact, it's funny because I'm just finishing up my second time through, maybe a little bit more than that, on a book about a doctor who got a traumatic brain injury and the insights that they gleaned. And a big one was she actually, it looks like she developed something similar to what a dyslexic would have ran into. She found it too difficult to read physical books. So she fell in love with audiobooks. But again, this doctor made a few other mistakes that I'll go into in a separate discussion. One example is she said how important it is for the traumatically injured. Uh, Dopamine helps, and she talked about taking some neurotropics, but she hesitates using cannabis or suggesting cannabis because there aren't enough studies yet. So she suggested a couple of pills that have no studies as it relates to being used as a neurotropic. Many of them are being used off brand as a neurotropic. But she's concerned about cannabis, a plant that we've been using for millennia. But worse yet is she was talking about the psychotropic effects of cannabis as being the negative or the worrisome part of it. So why not suggest non-psychoactive forms of cannabis? We have tons of this now. More so, I've said this so many times. I think this is what's going to make me famous. And I kid, but I think this is what, I mean, actually, just yesterday, someone laughed at me because I said what I call low frequency compounds. And she laughed and said, "Oh, what you call them?" Like, well, yeah, because I've been calling it that for over a decade or more. Nobody else has been calling, and nobody else has even been talking about the low frequency compounds in cannabis. So when I say that, obviously they weren't paying attention. Well, they were to a certain degree because I explained what I meant. I'm talking about the fact that so many people will talk about the cannabinoids and maybe the terpenes, but we don't talk about the sequiterpenes and all these other um, compounds in the cannabis plant that might be just as healing as the half dozen cannabinoids that we've already isolated. I argue more so if we don't decarboxylize our cannabis and we use it in the acid form, it gets rid of that concern of the psychoactive and obviously all the other issues it relates to TBI and in my case fatigue, which by the way may actually be tied to not just the autoinflammatory disease, an autoimmune disease, but it may even be tied to traumatic brain injury because she mentioned long-term fatigue and brain fog, reasons why you wouldn't want to take. Um, the similar to what was it? It was another. Oh, this was actually psychoactive or psychedelic. Sorry, psychedelic Buddhism, and he mentioned taking some LSD with a very large dose of cannabis. This is for entheogenic purposes, for healing purposes, and it was because of the sleepiness. Right. So right now I'm going back to my experiment that I used cannabis. I thought I was using it for the fatigue as it relates to the autoinflammatory. I thought I was using it for pain, obviously. And when I assumed when I got my disease in check, I wouldn't need it. But based on this doctor's insights, this fatigue that I battle may actually be related to traumatic brain injury because she herself mentioned that she could only work intensely for about an hour a day. Um, and she says it's very, what would you call it, variable. Because I find the same. First thing in the morning, not exactly vibrant. On my walk, I come up with some crazy great ideas. In the bath, I soak in an Epsom salt bath pretty much every day because of particular disease I have. It's called the sitz bath. It actually is beneficial in reducing inflammation, but also for skin issues. And I come up with great ideas in the bath, but then, because I have to have a hot bath, it kind of goes against the whole movement of cold showers and such. I have to have a hot bath because I need it to help pull out sebum from the sebacites, so it doesn't cause any blockages and abscesses. So it's not something that I can forego. Jeez, but once you get out of that hot bath, wow, you're tired, right? So a lot of insights today have come up, but the biggest one is the audiobooks. As I said yesterday, I was trying to explain how so many people go, "Oh, reading I can focus." No, reading you're forced to focus, whereas an audiobook you are almost empowered to be not focused because you can just pay attention to everything that's going on. And I've explained this before. My hack is to pay attention. I talk about having the correct speed. Either if you have trouble focusing, I would suggest listening to an audiobook in both ears, because even myself, I find it harder to follow an audiobook listening in one ear. So what I do is I slow it down. As an example, this morning I went on my walk. I was re-listening to an audiobook that I listened to, I think the first time through. I really wanted to glean some of it. I started at 1.5 times speed, which was fine, but I slowed it down to 1.35 for the first time through. Second time through, the 1.5 was no problem. In fact, I even advanced it up with 2 earbuds in. I advanced it to 1.7, 1.75 times speed. As a second time through, very beneficial, right? Because, you're listening to it the second time. And I think this relates to our focus, right? I didn't need to focus as much. So the example I give is an audiobook. If you're having trouble focusing first, we always assume maybe it's going too fast, but no one ever assumed, not no one, but infrequently we think about maybe the audiobook isn't fast enough. So crank up that speed. I argue most audiobooks are recorded faster than they are released, right? So your average audiobook will start at 1 time speed, and I think actually that's more like 0.9 or 0.8 times speed. I think the natural speed as it was probably recorded is 1.1 or 1.2, depending on the recorder. I've come across some books that the reader is like me. He speaks so fast that you can almost slow it down. So you have to set the speed for your focus, right? If it's too slow, you're not going to be able to stay focused because it's just unnatural. So you want to get it up to the speed that makes you most comfortable, right? So for me, that sometimes tends to be much higher, right? 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, 1.5. Sometimes, like with some of these, the great courses, these guys, ladies and gentlemen, speak so slowly. Some of them I listen to at 2 times speed, but not all the time. And I mean, being bombastic, that's very infrequent, right? On average, it's 1.6 times speed for the great courses, because again, they speak so slowly. What I found was, if it's too slow, I can't pay attention. If there's too much distraction, audio distraction, then I can't listen to it as fast. It takes more concentration. So that's why I recommend noise cancellation headphones covering both ears until you can get good at focusing on the audiobook. Right, I've used it all the time when I go into stores. For a while there, I was using the audiobooks to help me maintain my cool, right, keep me distracted. So all of the hubbub going on didn't bother me as much. But what I found is once you set that, you've set the proper speed, and obviously you need to have the right type of reader. LibriVox is terrible because even me, I ended up downloading a professional version of Schopenhauer's, some of his works, because the LibriVox version, I think it was Schopenhauer, the LibriVox version is terrible. There's one chapter, right? There's an hour or two of a lady, and no offense to the lady, love her to death that she's reading it, but her Italian accent is so thick it almost seems like they're messing with us. But it is a problem if they mispronounce words, if they have a really thick accent, if the content is a little above, your usual comfort level, right? All of these have to be taken into account and adjust the speed accordingly. More concentration required. Slow it down if need be. Sometimes speed it up. Uh, Possibly using both ears so that you could focus better. But the biggest takeaway that I've learned, and I actually came up with this all on my own, and just by accident in the last couple of weeks, I've read a book called The Gift of Dyslexia. And this is a gentleman who actually shares something similar to what I'm going to share, but mine is better. What he does is he realizes that the dyslexic needs to visually see language. So words like I and thee and a and all can be difficult to the dyslexic because it doesn't have a picture in the mind. I do. For words like all, I see someone standing with their arms open, right? Like gathering together a bunch of things, taking everything, all. The letter the word the, I see as like someone standing, like introducing someone on a stage. But what this gentleman, I don't think he's a doctor. My apologies. But what this gentleman does is he has kids, I guess, for the most part, shape letters and words out of clay, plasticine, so that they can have a physical representation. And I think that's a mistake because you can't do that for most things. So what I do is when I'm listening to the audiobook, it allows me to focus, allows me to retain, and I think it's actually allowed me to heal some of these maladaptive adaptations, what we would consider learning disabilities. I'm starting to agree that these are just learned behaviors that we have to fix, right? Developmental problems, right? Like you were having trouble in school at the time, so you didn't learn, and then you figured a way around it, but it was just bad habits. What I do is when I'm listening to an audiobook, after I've set the speed, sometimes faster, for me, most of the time faster. For some people, you might have to adjust it. Some books I have to listen to slower with both headphones in, others not as much. But the most important, I think, for me, so that you can remain focused and you're not having to go backwards all the time. But don't hesitate going backwards. Every audiobook app allows you to go back 20 or 30 or 15 seconds, depending on the app. And I highly recommend that, especially for what I read, right? Carl Jung, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, um, Martin Buber, Paul Tillich. These books do require some going back over, but don't hesitate on doing that. But the big thing for proper retention, so that you don't have to keep listening over and over the same thing to gain it. When I go back, it's because, wow, that was awesome. I want to hear it again, or I'm making a note, or I'm making a bookmark. What I find actually solves the problem of not being focused and not retaining the information, and solves the dyslexic problem, solves the problem for your average atypical who isn't as comfortable with audiobooks. Because I realized yesterday, I'm not like your usual bear. I was introduced to audiobooks at a young age because I volunteered to read books to the blind here in Canada. And they were one of the first organizations to open up their lending library to learning disabled individuals as well. So I had access to audiobooks. I learned about audiobooks, and for me, I didn't realize how many people didn't see the potential to audiobooks. Because even when I worked for the bank, the Institute of Canadian Bankers saw the potential. There's a few different institutes related to banking in Canada, but just as one example, they do the mutual funds course and the Canadian securities course for stockbroking and being an investment advisor, personal financial planner. There's a bunch of degrees that I got through them thanks to audiobooks, right? Even in college, most people don't realize that even back when I was in college, some of the textbooks were available in an audiobook format, some of them, but you had to get them special order. That was the crappy part. And they were cassette tapes at the time, so annoying. I'm listening to one book about some of the great minds of philosophy. Oh, no, even better. I'm listening to a book that I could only find from one source. I had to use the Hoopla app from my local library because it's not on Audible, it's not on Scribd, it's nowhere to be found. And the reason why, it's a book on Buddhist Tantra by a guy named Reg Ray. I do recommend it because it really is about my pranayama that I've been pushing for years, and Tantra, the idea that the way to enlightenment is through our everyday experience, not in spite of it, um, or like it's going through and over and under, more like the Uber mensch of Nietzsche, not, transcending, as it were. You're actually transforming, transmuting our experience into enlightenment. And what was funny is this was originally a book on CD. I think it was even a book on cassette going back far enough, but don't quote me on that. But even the Hoopla app, the recording, they didn't take out the interstitials, I guess you'd call it, because after each chapter, it'll be like, that's the end of the CD. If you turn over the CD, you get, you know what I mean? I've had it with that philosophy course. That one's cassettes, actually. It's end of cassette one of Schopenhauer. Please fast forward to the end and flip the cassette. It's really awesome to realize. But what's funny is when I was young, it was only the uber rich, it seemed, who realized the importance, because they realized the most valuable asset that you can't purchase is time. So they realized, you had to be more efficient with your time. Like what I do is I fart around with different things, listening to audiobooks as much as possible. But in recent months and years, as I advance, learning how to learn and learning to overcome my dyslexia and becoming, noti sotan, becoming an individual, a whole, a fullness, as it were, the pleroma, as Jung likes to talk about, but individuation, as I'm becoming who I am, learning to think and learning to learn. Um, I'm starting to realize these little things, right? Because when I was young, I thought, oh, audiobooks, that's for, dyslexics like me or rich people who don't have time to sit and read books. But what I've come to realize is, just like the doctor who had the traumatic brain injury, they didn't wake up to the power and the potential of audiobooks until they were no longer able to read physical books. Same as yesterday, I was attacked by a couple of gentlemen when I was discussing the power of audiobooks with another individual, and they were upset because they're like, no, audiobooks suck, you can't focus. And I'm like, dude, that's you. Like, you're failing at listening to audiobooks. Like, as they were saying, they're like, well, if a book forces you to pay attention and focus, and I can't focus listening to an audiobook, it's okay, right? Like, you just said the problem yourself. How dare you say that you know what I mean, I'm pushing some sort of propaganda about audiobooks, right? And I failed for the same reason. I used to think, oh, they're only for the dyslexic or for the blind, or, oh, for super rich people who are so busy, and you know what I mean? But it's not. It was only like that because you had to be blind to access, these books with the Canadian Institute for the Blind. You had to be a banker to access the audiobooks because, again, these things were expensive. So you also had to be a rich guy who accessed a small segment of the market that offered audiobooks, and at the time it was players. And I chuckled yesterday because these gentlemen who were saying the problem with audiobooks, all of which have been solved with audiobook apps. In the past, these problems were solved with special audiobook devices, right, which would have a forward and a back and all this sort of, any of these sorts of issues, right, which would allow you to speed it up, slow it down, fast forward a bit, fast forward a little bit, rewind a little bit, right, place little bookmarks. All of these little issues over time were solved. And yet, as I've said before, when I was young 30 plus years ago, I was told that everyone would be programming, right? I mean, I have Raspberry Pis. I have a Raspberry Pi here in the house, and it blows my mind that there isn't one of these in every house, right? For kids to learn how to program, right? I don't know if Jung was wrong. He talked about this reversion to the opposite. Could the argument be made that 30 years ago they promised technology would change our world, but as Marshall McLuhan thought, he thought it would change it for the better, not for the worse. But here we are. I wonder. But so I just thought I would share that. My my superpower is audiobooks. Somebody asked me for a reading list the other day, and I said, "Oh, geez, I couldn't do that," because I'm not exaggerating when I say that I read a book or two a day. I prefer to pick books by length, right? I bought a book yesterday. It cost me $13. I was hesitant, really highly rated book. I couldn't access it any other way. Didn't want to waste an Audible credit on it because an Audible credit cost me closer to $15, $16. But the reason why I hesitated most of all is I wanted to make it worthwhile, because I've become so jaded that I prefer reading 20 and 30 and 40 and 50-hour long works. And so when I say I read a book a day, I'm being a little bombastic, but I'm not. Because when I say that, it'll be, say, like one of the great courses, which are 18 hours long, or a Schopenhauer work that could be 50 hours long, or Nietzsche, it would be 20. Carl Jung's Red Book, 20 hours long. So that's the equivalent of 3, 4 regular books, maybe even longer, because, I was listening to a booktuber. They were talking last night about what they're going to read for August, and they're books that are 100, 150 pages long. That's not a book to me. That's barely a pamphlet, right? So if I were to stop reading these 20 and 30-hour long books, I could read 2 and 3 books a day. Because, right now it's not even 10 a.m., and I've already listened to one book this morning. And I took the neighbor's dog for a long walk and helped the neighbor with some issues that he had with his computer and his cell phone, and trying to get some pictures and an ad up on the internet for something. Right? Talked a little bit about some of the upgrades he wants to do on his house. And yeah. And during all that, not listening when we were chatting and doing that, I wasn't listening to the audiobook, but on my walk and then coming home, I was able to listen into an entire book this morning. Right? Now, that book is only 4 or 5 hours long, but at the speed I listened to, even at 135 speed, it was only a little over 3 hours long. Doesn't take a lot. But as I said, you really want to retain this stuff, and I recommend Mortimer Alder's work on how to read. And analytical reading doesn't begin till the second time through. So even though it's only 3 hour long, I'll actually listen to it at least twice. So, that's 6 hours, 8 hours of your time for one book. But that book will remain with me, arguably almost indefinitely. I may forget the title of the book, but the important details that I've used to inform my journey and well, as Jung says, inform who and what we are and where we're going. Phronesis in Greek. We consider it learned but innate, right? An acquired understanding of something, but an ability that was already resonant, kind of like our self-actualization. Most of us don't realize that we could be better but we have that potential within us, laying dormant. So if we don't realize this potential, if we don't access it, doesn't mean it's not there. So this is phronesis, anumana in Sanskrit, this idea of what some of us would consider induction. Others would consider a priori knowledge that we have, but that's a whole nother discussion. So on that, have a lovely day, and I hope, again, I'll just title this My Superpowers Audiobooks, and I hope the takeaway is I think we're really missing out that we're not teaching our children in school to use audiobooks, the power of audiobooks. I mean, I think it's been proven by all of the articles we see nowadays that offer you to be able to listen to the article, the popularity of videos and video platforms like YouTube and I can't think of any others at the current moment, SoundCloud, these platforms that allow people to consume their media in a non-typical way, right? As I've said many times before, we have forced people into believing this is how you access information. I mean, look how slowly we moved from physical books, if we even have yet, to ebooks, right? There's still a huge cadre of people who refuse to read ebooks, right? And many of them, I'm sure, may be learning disabled, but I don't think the vast majority are. I think they've just become accustomed to physical reading, even though initially it was more difficult. But since they're not constantly pushing themselves to be at the very edge of their comfort level with their skill and their capability, I guess, whatever, you know what I mean. Like with children, we teach them to speak, for example, by constantly challenging them, right? Speaking just above their competency level, thereby not discouraging them, right? You don't want to make it too high that they can't follow along, but just a little bit more advanced so that they're constantly evolving, bettering their skill, their competency. And I argue the same can be said when it comes to this. I mean, I think there's some cross contamination as well. I think my reading has gotten better, but being so severely dyslexic, as I said, I could read 3 or 4 books in a day and struggle to finish one physical book in a day. I mean, the example that I can think of right off the top of my head, Flowers for Algernon. That's a book that I read. Yeah, when was that? I can't remember. But it's about a 6-hour audiobook, which surprised me, right? I didn't know if it would be longer. I thought it'd be quite a bit less because there was a time that a book that would take most people 6 hours to read would take me a month to read. But I was able to read that in 1 or 2 sittings, so essentially in a day. So it probably only took me 6, 8, or 10 hours to read that. Now, the additional I had was nice lettering. I've learned something called dyslexic font, which is a cool thing to realize how important this is. So there's also something that I've come to learn. Lighting is important, the spacing, the size of the font, but also the shape of the font, right? So that's why some books I've been able to read very competently, retain the information, physical books. Other books, not so much. Why I have some books that I prefer and I go back too often might be for the same sort of reason, but I digress. So long story short, as Nietzsche said, he said, why do I learn so well? And for me, that's audiobooks and visualization, right? I think about what I learn and what I listen to and what I hear. And I try to visualize the words, in my head. And what I used to be told was an architect sort of mind, I believe, is a skill that we can all develop, and we need to.